This is The Critical Thinker, Episode 4. Hi everyone, welcome to the show. I'm Kevin Delaplante, your host, and on this episode, we're going to continue our discussion of why critical thinking matters. And this time, we're going to focus on the important role that critical thinking plays in sustaining a democratic culture. The last two episodes, we've been talking about the value of critical thinking in terms of rational self-interest. On the one hand, it can help to protect us from bad arguments and manipulative rhetoric, and in so doing, give us a space to think and deliberate about what we really believe and care about. That's critical thinking functioning as a kind of self-defense. It can help us with our defensive game. But last episode, we also talked about how it can help us with our offensive game. And by that I mean that it can help us to be more articulate and effective spokespeople for our own goals and values. It can give us a voice and a strength of influence that we might not otherwise have. That's what I'm calling critical thinking in the service of personal empowerment. Now, this is all well and good, but the value of critical thinking doesn't stop with individual self-interest. If we look past our noses, we see that we're not isolated islands, that we live in community with other people, and these communities form a society with institutions and governments that are designed to serve the needs of the people. Or at least that's the way it's supposed to work in so-called liberal democratic societies. What I want to talk about in this episode is the role of critical thinking specifically in liberal democratic societies, and what duties we as citizens have to try to be critical and independent thinkers. Now, just to clarify, when I say liberal democratic society, I'm not using the term liberal in the sense in which the term is commonly used in political discussions, where it's contrasted with conservative, like when we say that Michael Moore is a liberal and Rush Limbaugh is a conservative, or pro-choice activists are liberal and pro-life activists are conservative, or support for universal health care is liberal and opposition to it is conservative. That's not what the term liberal means in this context. When we call a society a liberal democratic society, we're using the older sense of the term, where liberal refers to liberty or freedom, and democratic refers to rule or governance by the people. So we're talking about forms of government where political power is invested ideally in the people, and they get to elect officials whose job it is to represent their interests and make policies and laws that serve those interests. These are democratic societies ruled by the people. What makes them liberal democracies is a specific conception of what the role of the state is with respect to its citizens. And part of this role is captured by what is sometimes called the doctrine of liberal neutrality. Now, what does this mean? Liberal neutrality is the view that individual citizens should be free to pursue their own conception of the good life, their own conception of what is ultimately good and valuable and important. That is, the state doesn't impose any particular conception of the good life on its citizens. It's neutral on this question. That's what neutrality means here. So, what's the job of the state? The job of the state is to ensure that you have as much freedom as possible to pursue your own good, your own happiness, consistent with everyone else having the same freedom to pursue their own good. That's the liberal part, the freedom part. Now, when it's phrased like this, it sounds more like classical 18th and 19th century liberalism, which is closer to libertarianism than to modern 20th and 21st century liberalism. And that's partly right. We're talking about liberalism as it was understood by people like John Stuart Mill and Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, which has a libertarian slant to it. But it's not entirely right. This concept of liberal neutrality is also consistent with the welfare liberalism of someone like John Rawls and contemporary progressive liberals who argue that justice requires a certain amount of redistribution of wealth from the rich to the poor. What's at issue between welfare liberals like Rawls and libertarians is just what is required for individuals to actually have and be able to exercise their basic rights and freedoms. There's a real disagreement here, but it's a disagreement about what liberal freedom demands and how it can best be achieved, not about the value of freedom per se, and not about the importance of liberal neutrality. On these issues, they're in agreement. They're all variations on a theme within the family of liberal democratic political philosophies. So, getting back to critical thinking, there are two questions I want to ask. One, what role does critical thinking play in maintaining liberal democracies? And two, do citizens of liberal democracies have a civic duty to cultivate their critical thinking faculties? I'll give you my answers up front. The answer to one is a big one, and the answer to two is yes. Now, to my mind, this is obviously true, but I know it's not to a lot of people, certainly not to my students, so here goes. Ideally, democracy is government by the people for the people. We, the people, are charged with electing officials to represent our needs and interests, and if we don't like how they govern, we have the power and the responsibility to vote them out of office. Now, as citizens, we're not normally involved in drafting laws and policies, but we're responsible for assessing the laws and policies that our elected and appointed officials propose and vote on. And doing this well requires both an informed citizenry and a citizenry capable of critically assessing arguments, pro and con, that pertain to the laws and policies in question. So that's one obvious reason why critical thinking is important. It's important because it's necessary to participate fully in the democratic process. But I think it goes even deeper than that. There's always been a kind of tension between democratic rule and classical liberalism. Liberalism emphasizes respect for individual rights and liberties, freedom of thought and expression, and so on. But democracy carries with it the potential for mob rule, the tyranny of the majority or the privileged classes, and the state-sanctioned oppression of minority classes. Think of the status of women or people of color or indigenous peoples or gays and lesbians in ostensibly democratic countries over the past 150 years. Now, when we think about the women's rights movement or the civil rights movement or other liberation movements, what I want to do is consider the importance of independent critical thought in making those movements possible. When it was illegal for women and people of color to vote and participate as equal citizens in government and society, the cultural norms and social pressures of the time made it easier to follow along and not question the rationale for those norms. So think now about what it would mean to ask at that time, how can this situation be rationally justified? What are the arguments for this position? Are they good arguments? Are all the premises plausible? Does the conclusion actually follow? Do they rely on background assumptions that can be challenged? Now, in asking these questions, we're just doing elementary argument analysis. But in this context, these are subversive, dangerous questions. They threaten an entire social order. So it's probably not surprising that in social groups that are deeply invested in perpetuating an oppressive social order, this kind of critical inquiry isn't going to be valued. It's going to be controlled or suppressed if it's seen as asking people to question the foundations of the established social order. George Orwell wrote about this at length in his essays and novels. Socrates was put to death for asking questions that challenged the worldview of the established authorities of his day. Now, my claim is not that teaching critical thinking will magically wipe away oppression and human injustice. Of course, there's no guarantee that simply raising these questions is going to cause the scales to fall from people's eyes and see the error of their ways. My claim is simply that it's harder for oppressive policies and beliefs to gain a foothold in a democratic society that openly supports the value of critical thinking and Socratic inquiry. Not that it's impossible, just that it's harder. So, to the extent that we care about freedom and equality and justice and the ideals of liberal democratic governance, I think we should also care about critical thinking and the values of Socratic inquiry. I think they go hand in hand. You can't value one without valuing the other. Now, I also think it's obvious that we in fact live in a very non-ideal world, where principles of liberal democratic governance can be undermined by internal corruption, excessive nationalism, corporate lobbying, geopolitical threats, globalization, war, resource scarcity, you name it. But I think these challenges just make the case for critical thinking even stronger. If liberal democracy survives and flourishes through this century, it will be because we somehow managed to foster and exercise our capacity for critical and creative thinking in tackling the problems of our time. Now, we've been talking about the importance of critical thinking for liberal democracy. The second question I wanted to ask was, in light of all this, do we as citizens have a duty to cultivate our rational critical thinking faculties?